mill deck here against Alejandro Olea Garcia, who is on Spirits. Now, this mill deck, it's been on the fringes of playability for a while now, but there's been a couple of additions in recent sets that have helped it out a bit. Plus, the metagame is pretty good for it right now.
Yeah, from Guilds of Ravnica, a big addition has been Mission Briefing, which allows you to cast some cards in your graveyard. And importantly, you can pay alternative costs for that, which means that if you have an archive trap in your graveyard, you may be able to cast it from your graveyard for free with that mission briefing. This adds a bit to the consistency of the whole mill strategy, which is very simple. Opponent starts at 60 cards, 53 after the opening hand. Just put them all into the graveyard and then kill your opponent by decking.
Which, of course, in principle, if you've got 4 archive traps in hand at the start of the game, 7 cards drawn in the starting hand, 53 left, 4 13s is 52. You can pretty much end the game if they activate a fetch land on their first turn. Now, obviously, that doesn't come up too often, but there's a couple of other things going on with this deck right now that are pretty good. This is a deck that likes to run Surgical Extraction. It naturally can get things into the graveyard without having to worry about them ever hitting play. And you know what? Surgical Extraction, pretty good in a metagame where there's quite a few powerful graveyard decks, or decks that really do rely on a specific card to be able to get whatever it is that they're doing going.
Well, speak of the devil, there is the Surgical Extraction. Now, it looks like this is all still in response to the Mausoleum Wanderer that is still on the stack. And lots of cards being cast for 0 mana.
Manages to snipe a copy from Alejandro Olea Garcia's hand as well there, and it looks like he's electing not to take the one that's in the graveyard. I guess that if you're running, let me think of the name of the card. The card that lets you draw 3. Oh, if you're running either Sheldock Isle or Visions of Beyond, you want to make sure there's lots of cards in your opponent's graveyard. So leaving one Phantom in the graveyard there, not that big a deal, but it does mean that potentially you might get to a point where they have extra cards in their graveyard they might not otherwise. Yep. Interesting.
Yeah, and both Sheldock Isle and Visions of Beyond are in Jason Chung's deck, so that could be relevant. So far this the mill strategy is as simple as it gets. Banned Spirits on the left side, that's arguably the deck to beat in Modern right now, has won the previous 2 individual Modern GPs. But its deck size is slinking. There's the Mesmeric Orb.
Mesmeric Orb, a symmetrical effect. Whenever a permanent becomes untapped, that permanent's controller puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. And that's something that it looks innocuous, but it does add up. Especially if you end up with multiple Mesmeric Orbs in play, you can really start to feel the pain of, oh, I'm nearly decked, but I can't really be tapping any lands or any creatures to attack with. Especially decks that like to go wide, maybe making tokens and so on, can end up really feeling the pinch on that one.
Yeah, Mesmeric Orb and also Hedron Crab are 2 of the ways to have repetitive mill effects on the battlefield. Because with just a bunch of Glimpse the Unthinkables and Archive Traps, you may not necessarily get there.
So Sheldock Isle came down. Sheldock Isle, a hideaway land. Once a player has 20 or fewer cards left in their library, which is certainly something the mill deck can reasonably achieve, you can play the card hidden away under Sheldock Isle for just a single blue mana and a tap of that land. And I believe that the card hidden away under there is another archive trap. So in principle, if Jason Chung can get close to milling out Alejandro Olea Garcia, he will be able to get the final points in style with Sheldock Isle.
It's a good plan for sure, because once you get down to 20 or fewer cards, then that archive trap will turn it into 7 cards. And with it Mesmeric Orb, you are almost there.
In a weird sort of way, the mill deck, it almost feels like a burn deck of sorts. It's just that rather than dealing its damage in points of 3 and needing to deal 20, it's dealing its damage in points of, 7, 13, all sorts of surprisingly large numbers, but it needs to deal 60.
Yeah, exactly. The life total, so to speak, of the opponent is a bit larger than for a typical burn deck, but the gist of the strategy is indeed similar as you describe.
So Mission Briefing here coming along, and this is going to be one that potentially is going to set up another archive trap here, because I think we have just had another fetch land played.
I believe you are correct. So even somewhat surprising that this Mission Briefing was allowed to resolve. Would have actually expected Alejandro Olea Garcia to counter it with Mausoleum Wanderer to prevent this interaction. But yeah, typically with cards like Snapcaster Mage, you give a card in your graveyard flashback, which means that you would be able to cast the Archive Trap for 5 mana. But Mission Briefing works different from Snapcaster Mage. It allows you to cast the card, which means that you can pay alternative cost like the 0 mana one on Archive Trap. And that is one of the interactions that made the deck a bit better in recent months. This Mission Briefing did come from Guilds of Ravnica.
So Alejandro just confirming that he understands exactly how Mission Briefing works in this context, because it is a little bit of an unusual interaction, one that maybe wasn't necessarily clear to everyone when the card was first printed.
Yeah, it's probably the first time that this interaction comes up for Alejandro.
Alexander Hayne has already picked up his first game with Hardened Scales against Niels Gutierrez on Is It Phoenix. So Jason Chung, Sleepy J as we call him today, may not even need to get everything done. Of course, if his teammates are doing well enough, then even if he loses this game, or indeed this match, it might all be fine. But right now, it's kind of really tricky to tell how well the mill deck is doing until the final few points, because every card that you're milling that's not actually winning the game, it's almost irrelevant, and in some cases is helping your opponents.
Yeah, it's only once the opponent goes down to 0 cards in the library that this decking plan actually works. And also good on Alejandro to just verify with a judge whether or not this interaction indeed works the way Jason explained. It does, but it is never a bad thing to check if you are not sure. That's what judges are there for, to just confirm and explain some of the wacky interactions that you might face in a format like Modern.
Oh, I love Archive Trap. It's one that I've been playing since it was in Standard. I had a weird Pyromancer Ascension deck that could, in response to a fetch land, play Trapmaker Snare to fetch up 2 copies of Archive Trap because it was being copied with Pyromancer Ascension, then play those 2 copies twice to mill people for 52. It was a lot of fun. But Crypt Incursion here, another reason why that Surgical Extraction would have wanted to leave creatures in the graveyard, because now Jason Chung gets to exile all of those creatures and gain life for each creature exiled in that way. So Jason Chung's life total just going massively into the sky. That sky populated largely by angels and spirits and so on. But you know what? It's going to take a while for those angels and spirits to actually knock down Jason from 47.
47, that is just ridiculous. 3 mana to gain, 30 life or so? Yep. Well, when you go through the effort of milling cards into graveyards, Crypt Incursion is a pretty solid way to buy a lot of time. It's even, when you play against decks like Dredge or decks with Arclight Phoenix, it's even a relevant piece of interaction. Not so much in this matchup, but it is maybe also one of those reasons why Mill got a bit more popular as of late. You have all these graveyard reliant decks, and you have main deck ways in Crypt Incursion and Surgical Extraction to interact with them. On the other hand, it's also kind of a double-edged sword. As we count, so that's 20. Looks like
28, I believe.
Something like that, yeah. So getting at least close to a Sheldog Isle activation, but it will require milling over a few more additional cards.
Inquisition of Kozilek. It's going to be a bit of a messy one because it reveals 2 copies of Collected Company, one of which is almost certainly going to get cast at the end of turn here. Yes, it can take a Drogskull Captain or indeed that Spell Queller, but we can see here that Olea Garcia still has a fantastic play for this turn here. It did seem a little suspicious that he passed with 4 mana up.
Yes. Well, when you're playing against Banned Spirits, then you know what's up. In fact, I think Jason still knew the presence of Collected Company from the Surgical Extraction earlier this game.
I mean, it's practically a swing and a miss. Just the one Drogskull Captain
That
coming
is
out of a
yeah.
Collected Company here.
And yeah, Collected Company does cost you 4 extra cards from your library, thanks to that Mesmeric Orb. So getting closer and closer to that deck size of 20, which would enable the activation of Sheldog Isle.
So 9 damage coming through here, and Jason Chung really doesn't seem that bothered. He's on such a high-low total right now that a swing here and there, you know, what's 9 damage between friends?
Yeah.
Jason, he'll be fairly familiar with a lot of the decks in this modern format, and you get to see a lot of your opponent's deck configuration over the course of these games. So sort of, you get to go in with your eyes open for games 2 and 3.
Yeah, then you know what's up. So I think we're after Alejandro will untap both spirits and takes the mesmeric orb triggers, then draws a card. I think he's down to 20 or fewer cards in his library. So these Sheldog Isles are gonna be active soon. There's no big mill card in here.
No, we see Collective Brutality or Surgical Extraction, the interesting options here. That Polluted Delta, not very exciting, it must be said. Haven't seen any Hedron Crabs from Jason just yet.
He just hasn't drawn them. He does have 4 copies in his deck list. It's still one of the better mill cards in the modern format. It's 10, 15...
Exactly 20 cards left. That means that Sheldog Isle is active. So Jason is going to be milling for 6 here when Alejandro Alea Garcia untaps, meaning 14 cards left.
Yeah, actually, if this
might be worth playing the Archive Trap now.
Well, you might also let it resolve, and then basically let Alejandro shrink his own library size down to 19. Then let him untap, go down to 13, and then you cast the Archive Trap. Though this might be dangerous if he hits a Mausoleum Wanderer off of the Collected Company, because then he might be able to counter the Archive Trap. So maybe you want to cast Archive Trap before, so as to not give Alejandro an opportunity to hit Mausoleum Wanderer off the top.
Now, one slightly strange thing about all of this Collected Company, in principle, would allow Alejandro to almost perfectly order the rest of his deck after a Collected Company, because you put the rest back in any order. As things stand, he would really struggle to deal 32 damage without tapping a few more permanents, which then in turn would untap, which then in turn would get milled out. So Jason Chung picking up the win there, and we're going to get a chance to have a look at Alex Hain in his game too. He's on Hardened Scales up against Niels Gutierrez on Is It Phoenix. Just an Ancient Stirrings to kick things off for the Canadian Alexander Hain. Gutierrez here. Early doors, I anticipate seeing him just sort of manipulating his deck a bit, maybe trying to get a Phoenix into his graveyard.
That is one of the main plans of this deck. Another one of those decks that got a boost from Guilds of Ravnica, or in fact, it didn't even exist before Guilds of Ravnica introduced Arclight Phoenix. It's always impressive to me how Modern is undergoing fairly big changes with the release of every set in recent memory. But well, if Niels manages to hit a Fateless Looting here, he might be able to get some Arclight Phoenixes into the graveyard and get them back right away.
Yeah, look at this. Turn 2. How many spells do you want to play there?
I mean, he has the 3 spells. He just doesn't have Arclight Phoenix yet.
Oh well. Didn't quite sequence it all in a way that he's able to get a bunch of birdies in play, but you know what? There's still time.
There was a whole bunch of spinning your gears and not actually accomplishing anything yet. Though I guess he dug deeper into his deck, and maybe he has set up a reasonable hand for the next turn.
Well, it looks like there's a relatively potent sideboard card in Alexander Hain's hand that he's going to play sometime relatively soon in Damping Sphere. Hangback Walker the play for him this turn, though. Get that one out on the battlefield.
So for those of you asking for the deck list of Jason Chung, deck lists at Grand Prix events are never made public before the end of the Swiss rounds. But there is a good chance that his deck list will be published on the event coverage page at the end of the tournament, assuming that Jason keeps doing well. Alternatively, yeah, you can also find him on Twitch or Twitter Sklut. I'm not even sure how to pronounce that, to be honest.
Yeah, not quite sure myself on that one. It's a bit of a funny spelling. But yes, Jason's a pretty friendly chap. I'm sure that if you get in touch with him, he'd be willing to share it after the tournament. But sharing his list during the tournament doesn't seem very fair on anyone that's innovated their way to something a little bit different here in this modern format.
Once we get to the top 4, it's top 4, not top 8, because it's a team event. The deck list for the top placing players will be put on the event coverage website.
Yeah, at least that way, everyone in the top 4 is in the exact same level playing field in terms of levels of knowledge. As opposed to, we can't reasonably give out everyone on day one's deck lists. In part, who would type them, but also it would be rough on the ones that did get seen versus those that don't. So, how about Walker getting killed off here after a Thing in the Ice coming down? Thing in the Ice now on 3 counters for Niels Gutierrez. Won't take too long for that one to transform into an Awoken Horror.
Yeah, and this is the big reason for the Phoenix deck to run blue. Thing in the Ice is a big threat, super efficient for just 2 mana, easy to transform with so many card draw spells, and it's another big payoff creature for running so many cheap card draw spells in the deck. It might easily flip this turn, at which point you have a 7/8 Awoken Horror. You bounce the Lone Topter token, and suddenly have a huge clock.
Damping Sphere does slow things down quite a bit in terms of what the Is It Phoenix deck looking to do. The first spell, you can cast that however you want, but the second spell here costing 1 additional mana, so you see there Serum Vision ending up costing 2 mana rather than just 1 because of the Damping Sphere. And while that's not so much of a worry for the Thing in the Ice, it can still get there. In terms of getting an Arclight Phoenix into play, it's a pretty big rake.
It is, and it's definitely useful for that. At this point, however, Damping Sphere is mostly, it buys you some time, but Alexander Hayne doesn't really have the pressure on the board to leverage that extra time. If Alexander Hayne were attacking for, 5 or 10 points per turn, then that mana denial aspect of Damping Sphere would have been huge. Here, you're just attacking with a Topter per turn, so it's not like that extra time is giving you much of an advantage.
So a little bit of pressure on Alexander Hayne here. Ben Jones on Crockline Ironworks has picked up his game 1 against Andre Strasky's Spirits. Spirits, a deck that Andre is very familiar with, having had great success with it already at Modern GPs in this relatively recent Modern season.
And Alexander Hayne has seen enough. I think he is just asking a judge a rules question away from the table. Might pertain to the Damping Sphere somehow, but that's always a legal thing to do if you're not sure how certain cards interact or work out. Just ask a judge, and you are allowed to do that away from the table, so as to not give your opponent the information, or potentially having to give away what you have in your hand.
Yeah, in the interest of tournament magic, it is actually much better to ask for permission than forgiveness. If you get something wrong because you've not found out what the interaction is, that's not necessarily a great excuse. Meanwhile, if you double check something beforehand and a judge says it's cool, then you know what? It's cool.
I'm hoping to see something cool this turn, because the Hardened Skills deck is capable of doing cool things.
Damping Sphere in itself makes life a little fiddly in terms of playing some of the very coolest combinations of bits and pieces.
Yeah, it also affects yourself, so you can just easily cast multiple spells per turn. And for example, you cannot just play, say, an Arcbound Ravager and then also a Steel Overseer, because the Damping Sphere also taxes your own spells.
Alright, Thopter beat achieved. That much was the easy bit. Let's see what the follow-up is. There is an Arcbound Ravager. The Ravager, I believe, is one of the things that enables the most cool plays that come from the deck. And here we go. Let's sacrifice our Damping Sphere, because it is making life a little bit awkward. Walking Ballista is very definitely a friend of Arcbound Ravager.
So I think that's also what Hein was asking the judge. If the Damping Sphere is no longer around when I would go to cast my second spell, does that extra text still apply? And the answer is no, you are then able to cast the second spell without having to pay the additional mana.
Walking Ballista successfully managing to get all the way up to 5 counters, enough to kill off that thing in the ice before it transforms into Oaken Horror. And now we've got one Walking Ballista on one side, just lands on the other side of things for Nils Gutierrez.
Yeah, so a very nice turn there by Alexander Hein. It's a bit weird to sacrifice the Damping Sphere, the sideboard card you brought in for this matchup, to your own Arcbound Ravager, but it is what he needed to do in order to have access to both Arcbound Ravager and Walking Ballista on this turn. And yeah, by just eating a bunch of artifacts, then sacrificing the Arcbound Ravager to itself. With Modular, you can then make the Walking Ballista big enough. It doesn't really care where the +1/+1 counters come from, as long as they are +1/+1 counters. And it's very important that Hein was able to take out that thing in the ice, otherwise he would have been facing a big 7-8.
So here's an Abrade on Walking Ballista. Doesn't matter how much mana Alex Hein has available to him, he wouldn't be able to pump it out of the way of that piece of artifact removal. Gets one parting shot off on Gutierrez before that resolves, and then here comes a Steel Overseer. Ceremonious Rejection, a sideboard card coming in from Gutierrez's side of things. Turns out, though, when you've got 2 Steel Overseers, one of them's bound to resolve.
Hein has the last laugh here.
Thought Scour getting a few extra cards in the graveyard. Nary a Phoenix to be seen thus far, Frank Carsten.
Yeah, they are not really showing up. The only threat that Niels had found so far was the thing in the ice, but that one was shut down by the Walking Ballista. And now, if Hein is able to untap with the Steel Overseer, that is not going to spell good news for Gutierrez. Steel Overseer is one of the... I mean, it's really fragile. It just dies to anything, but if it sticks around, it is hard to beat. At least for any creature-based deck.
Gut Shot there. Gut Shot, often a card that is essentially just there as being a spell that can be cast without having to pay any mana. But in this instance, a very, very reasonable target found in Steel Overseer. Get rid of the Overseer before it's going to be able to put counters on anything. Powerful effect Phyrexian mana enables.
Yep. That was a very key removal spell for Niels there.
An Ancient Stirrings now for Alex Hein allows him to find yet another threat, in this case another copy of Hangerback Walker, just being cast as a 1/1. Imagine how different this game would have looked had there been a Hardened Scales in play in the early stages of this game.
Oh yeah, well, it is the namesake card of the deck. It just makes everything better, basically twice as good, because so many cards in the deck do something with +1/+1 counters. But yeah, without Hardened Scales, a card like Hangerback Walker can still be fine. You know,
it saw a fair amount of play in Standard.
Yeah, it's a bit of value, boost itself, good synergy with Arcbound Ravager at some point. But it's not putting up a huge clock, not anytime soon. So this does give Niels a lot of time to set up his pieces. So in general, I found it interesting how a lot of the people who love to play with Mox Opal and Arcbound Ravager moved over from an affinity list with Cranial Plating, Edge Champion. Now many of them are running Hardened Scales and Hangerback Walkers and Walking Ballistas. I think this does have something to do with the general theme in Modern of like people going more and more for decks that goldfish quickly, just trying to be non-interactive and have a fast kill. And the Hardened Scales deck is a bit more combo-esque and able to set up those fast kills a bit more reliably than the old Edge Champion Cranial Plating Affinity deck.
As things stand, at least for now, Alex Hein having to play a game that looks pretty similar to a regular Affinity deck. He's not been able to get any of the really bonkers synergies that are really specific to the Hardened Scales deck going just yet, in part because he's not seen a Hardened Scales yet this game. But conveniently for him, he has not really seen the best of what can come from the Is It Phoenix list. No Phoenixes to be found over there, and while there's been a lot of digging, there hasn't really been a whole lot of treasure found just yet for Gutierrez.
So I do think this Inkmoth Nexus is threatening lethal on the next turn via some, pump the Hangerback Walker, then sacrifice the Arcbound Ravager, then sacrifice all the top tier tokens, the Arcbound Ravager, maybe animate some Blinkmoth Nexuses, sacrifice those to the Arcbound Ravager as well. You likely have to pump the Inkmoth Nexus at some point with a Blinkmoth Nexus, and then sacrifice the Arcbound Ravager to itself to move 9 counters over to Inkmoth Nexus. Obviously that would be a super risky line when the opponent might just respond with, well, a lightning bolt on an Inkmoth Nexus in response. But those are the types of plays that this Hardened Skills deck is capable of. It can present lethal damage pretty rapidly via these Hangerback Walker, Arcbound Ravager interactions.
Okay, so we've finally seen what the 4-mana is being tapped for. This one is Crackling Drake. Comes into play, draws a card, and it will have a pretty substantial power here. Not quite sure how many spells are in the graveyard, but it's not a small number at this stage in the game.
Alright, let's do a count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12...
Something of that stripe, certainly. This is going to be a Crackling Drake.
Oh, and also the 2 Faithless Lootings that are exiled.
Yeah. So currently, it's a 2-hit Drake. In terms of closing the game out, that's the kind of the important number. Arcbound Worker, though, representing a couple of extra counters, just because of the way that Modular will interact here.
It's effectively 2 counters, because if you sacrifice the Arcbound Ravager, you get a counter from the Ravager ability, and then also a counter from the Worker's Modular.
Blinkmoth Nexus getting animated, and a small attack here from Hain.
Yeah, it looks like he's going for the regular damage route, especially when there's a blocker to block the Inkmoth Nexus route, and you have way more creatures that deal regular damage. Also, with the opponent at 12, there's not a big difference between going for regular damage or poison damage.
Yeah, you've already effectively done the work, so regular damage is almost the same.
Mm-hmm. So if Niels were to block one of these creatures, then a likely play that Hain has access to is sacrifice either the Worker or the Hangerback Walker to Arcbound Ravager, potentially move over counters to the Blinkmoth Nexus if that is the creature that's being blocked, and then have them trade with the Crackling Drake. I don't think there's immediately lethal. If suppose Niels doesn't block, then Hangerback Walker is gonna get activated, then sacrificed. So that's +4. There's another Nexus activation. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. If I counted correctly, then Niels would not die if he doesn't block.
Pretty close, though, and obviously there's a temptation to do exactly that, in part because it means that you get to swing back, and it is possible for the Is It Phoenix deck to just have a flurry of spells and potentially get to 20 here. Speaking of players that have got there, Jason Chung, his mill deck, 2-0, got there. He will be happy to make sure that he's in day 2, and ideally looking to have a quick round next round as well, so he can maybe have a little sleep at some point. On the other side of things, Andrei Stradsky has also squared things up against Krot Clan Ironworks. So this team, Alexander Hain and Andrei Stradsky, between them, they need to find one more game win to lock up their place in day 2.
And honestly, I think Hain does have an advantage here in the current game. A seemingly obvious play is to turn the Arcbound Ravager into a 4/4. Have a trade with Crackling Drake, and then after it dies, just use the modular trigger to put the counters on some other threat.
Yeah, a fair amount of artifacts to sacrifice here if Hain wants. Sacrificing the Hangerback Walker here. Obviously, all of those tokens also potentially food for the Ravager.
Yeah, this Crackling Drake is still big enough. Like, I think we were at like 14 power. so that keeping the Ravager around is not a reasonable option. But this is a trade that Hein is, I think, perfectly happy with. You get rid of the big threat on the other side of the board, and you now use the modular to turn, say, the Blinkmont Nexus into a 5/5.
All right, clear board again. Niels Gutierrez just cannot keep a creature on the battlefield just now.
Argwant Ravager still doing work ever since its days in Mirrodin block 15 years ago. It has been a mainstay of Magic.
Very powerful card. One of the things that I really like about it, and I suspect that you might feel the same way, Dr. Frank, is the fact that it does present a little bit of a puzzle when it comes to how best to utilize it. Do you get aggressive and start sacrificing lots of artifacts to pump something up, or do you play things a little bit more cagey or somewhere in between?
Oh yeah, you can always wake me up in the middle of the night for some Argwant Ravager math puzzles. Actually, I may still be angry that you woke me up in the middle of the night, but if you do it, then at least have some Ravager math puzzles at the ready.
Deal. So Niels Gutierrez with a bit more of a puzzle on his hands here. He's at 12 life. He's managed to stave off much of the attacks that came this last turn, but a lot of work to be done for him. Thought Scour not really achieving too terribly much for him there. More spells in the graveyard. I mean, I guess that even something like a maximized velocity on a Crackling Drake, there's a bunch of blockers on the other side of the table. I'm not sure how he's able to leverage whatever cards he's got in hand into an actual win here.
Yeah, I think one of the best ways for Niels to come back from this position is via Thing in the Ice. If he can find Thing in the Ice quickly, well, there we have it. Mad respect to the man in the ice cream van. Then play 4 spells or instants or sorceries. Then, well, at least all those Tapters are going away. And it also means that if that Blinkmont Nexus is caught during a Thing in the Ice transformation, it's going to return, and all those +1/+1 counters are effectively going to disappear.
Oh, there's a Manamorphose in hand. He could spin the wheel here. There's also an Arclight Phoenix, though. I can see there's a temptation that if he can try and find a way of getting that Arclight Phoenix in the graveyard, maybe by flashing back a Faithless Looting, that he might be able to set up for a great turn later where he gets to have all of the options available to him. But I don't know that there's time for that, so he does go for the Manamorphose here. Ideally wants to find a Gut Shot. That's
Ooh.
A perfect kind of spell for this situation.
It even hides that you might be able to transform the Thing in the Ice, given
So
that you can cast it for 0 mana.
An Opt here, still with red floating, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Keeping the dream alive of casting more Manamorphoses.
So 1 mana remaining in pool.
Looking for another cheap spell. I love the fact that he might be able to pass the turn with 1 counter on this Thing in the Ice and potentially bait out an activation of some number of these Nexi on the other side of the battlefield and really make life difficult.
Alright, so now Hein is thinking, well, there's at least there's just 1 land untapped, so there's no way that Thing in the Ice is going to transform this turn. I can just attack with my Blinkmont Nexus and all my Tapters. However, if Niels did find another instant, like an Opt along with Gutshot, he will be able to transform the Thing in the Ice.
And this will be one of those areas where if you're Niels Gutierrez, you're really hoping that any of your teammates that are watching and quote-unquote helping you didn't react too much to exactly what's going on in your hand, because you really don't want to give any extra information to a player like Alex Hein. But Alex is activating 2 copies of Inkmoth Nexus. I think there's a Lightning Bolt in hand. This could end very poorly for the Canadian player on the right of our screen.
Boy.
Goes for the Gut Shot first. And Hein beginning to realize the situation he finds himself in here. A Lightning Bolt at you, and
This is just absolutely insane. Just 1 turn ago, Niels only had 5 lands on the battlefield and was facing down 9 power worth of flyers. Now, just by using 5 lands, and well, the cards that he put into his deck for a reason, he has dealt with all of those attackers. He's not under any pressure anymore, and now he's suddenly the one who gets to attack with a 7/8. Man, this deck, when it's doing its thing, is really impressive.
It's very cool. As it turns out, the fact that Hayne might not win this game, in fact, completely does not matter. Andre Stradsky, with his spirit, he found a way against Ben Jones on Crackland Ironworks and has been able to win the match without Alexander Hayne even needing to get anything done here. So gigantic attacks coming from Niels Gutierrez, but this is ultimately all a consolation prize for him. He's going to have to wait until next round to potentially lock up a slot in day 2, because the team of Stradsky, Hayne and Chung, even though Hayne not able to get there in this particular game, have been able to triumph there. So good work from them. Really enjoyed seeing the likes of Jason Chung's mill deck in there. Jason Chung, he's already well out of that feature match area. Potentially, you know, having a little snooze somewhere, just keeping himself together. Already having had the gigantic travel all the way across from New Zealand for this event, partly in preparation, it must be said, for the World Magic Cup. He's going to be there as well, but getting a little bit of extra magic in this weekend and making that flight count. He changed his flight to make sure he could get here early enough, and it worked out for him. Those guys
Perfectly.
locked up in day 2, and we'll get a chance to see a little bit more magic in the form of Time Walk magic right after these messages.